Jesus doesn't lower the bar, right, when it comes to marriage. What he's saying here is that unless there has been sexual immorality, and the person who commits sexual immorality, by the way, is not permitted to remarry if they knew that they were in a Christian marriage. So he's saying, if you divorce your spouse, right, and your spouse has committed adultery, you are free to get married again. So that's something permissible. But the person who commits adultery is not to get remarried again. Again, we're speaking about somebody who's obviously a born-again Christian. They understand what's going on. They knew what they're getting into, okay? So, now, if you are married and there has been no adultery, but you get a divorce and you go get remarried, that's considered adultery when you get married. Now that has eaten a lot of people up, and I can understand why. But notice what Jesus says. He says that when it comes to marriage, he says that if a person marries another, and I'm going to go over to Matthew 19 in a little bit, right? And does so after, not having biblical grounds for remarriage, that person commits adultery. But the person is still considered married, right? That's a beautiful thing. Like, in other words, God can still bless in such beautiful ways. If you are in a position where you go, man, I've been married before and I knew that I shouldn't have got divorced and I went through the divorce, but man, what do I do? Like, it feels like God brought us together. It feels like this. Well, it would be like, if we're looking at what words we have from Jesus, I think that if Heather and I were to get a divorce and there was no adultery and I was to marry somebody else and I'm reading Jesus' words, I'm looking at this like I would need to say, okay, God, you recognize that I'm married. The solution isn't to go and divorce my spouse, but I did commit adultery on the front end here. And that's kind of the way to understand that. Now, that is heavy stuff when you think about it. Now, it's not condemning language. That it's more like what God is trying to preserve is that he wants that one couple for a lifetime. And what he's trying to say is when we start just coupling with lots of other people, we're getting beyond what my intent was. Now, that doesn't mean that God's not a gracious God. He doesn't come in and absolutely bless. But it's hard for him to want to come in and create an open door for us to start multiplying marriage after marriage after marriage. So what he does is he holds up the ideal. One man, one woman for a lifetime. He holds up the ideal because God is holy. He does that even in our own individual Christian lives, right? He says, be holy as I am holy. He keeps that standard there, but none of us do that all the time, right? So some of you might be thinking, okay, well, if God is gracious in this way and he can still, work all things for good, then I'm just going to dump my spouse and I'm going to go find somebody else and I'm going to just ask for forgiveness and we'll be good. But that's not the right mindset, right, Pastor P? Yeah. That's a sign of a hard heart. So I would just say, I want to teach this kind of passage in a very gracious way as well. And obviously Jesus, think about how Jesus taught the woman, who had 5 husbands, right? The woman at the well. I mean, he talk about love and grace. Think about how Jesus was with the woman who got caught for committing adultery. Forgives her, right? Go and sin no more. So what he does is he shows love, right? Go and sin no more. Or he forgives her, shows love, but he also holds out truth. Go and sin no more. And what can happen a lot in church, I think, is sometimes you sit under a message where you feel like you just hear the go and sin no more message without the love, right? But other times it feels like you hear the love message where there's no standard to be called to. And so I think the proper way for us to look at this is to just hold the standard. So I shared last week, right? When I was 17, I got a girl pregnant who had an abortion. Well, I can look at my life and maybe say, well, my life never would have ended up the way that it did. And it'll look, maybe, my life's turned out good. My life would have went a completely different direction. But that doesn't make my decision right. I was still wrong for the baby to be aborted, right? That wasn't I didn't have the right to be a part of that, right? And by the way, the lie that our body we can't do anything we want with our body. I can't walk up and just punch you in the face just because this is my body. Like we sometimes think, you know what I mean? And it's insanity that would think, you could be driving to an abortion clinic and get hit by a drunk driver. The drunk driver then would have to go to prison because the baby dies in your womb. But had you not gotten hit, you would go into the abortion clinic and off the baby. Do you see the inconsistency here? Right? Again, this is all stuff that's been fueled by absolute ultra left-wing stuff that does not value. Like just if it's really a human, right? If God's the creator of it, then we can't just kill the baby because we don't want it. And it's like I shared a couple weeks ago, that one person who was, she was an ultra-left feminist, and she ended up, realizing once she got pregnant, why is my language changing? She said, my language is changing because now all of a sudden, if I want the baby, it's my child, but if I don't, it's just tissue. Something is fundamentally wrong, and she realized it. I think most people realize it, that what was wrong with me at 17? Again, I'm speaking as a person who got a girl pregnant. I just didn't want the inconvenience at 17. I didn't feel responsible, right? But I deep down felt something was fundamentally wrong while she was getting this done. Now, I become a Christian, and what do? Do I just justify my past decision? No, I own it and say it was wrong, but I also then recognize that God is gracious and look at what he did. He turns out beautiful things in our life. So I think sometimes just because things turn out good in our life doesn't mean that that's God saying what you did was right. No, it just means that God is so good that he does what is right in spite of. And he wants us to be able to acknowledge that and confess that. And when we do, there's healing and there's grace. I hope this makes sense. Now, as we look at these words then, some would say, but I say to you, everyone who divorces his wife except on the ground of sexual immorality. Some have noted that Jesus is referring to the betrothal period, that is the engagement period, that when those are engaged, guess what? They're saying that Jesus' standard of divorce was so high that the only way out of an engagement was through adultery. That's the exception clause. Now, I don't think that's the way to see it. I think he's saying if there was sexual immorality, it makes her, then that's what happens. Okay, there's so much that could be talked about here. There's a lot going on. Now, in Matthew 19, the disciples are with Jesus, and what ends up happening in this passage, I'm just going to turn over there briefly and try to summarize it for us for time's sake. But basically what happens, Pharisees come up to him and they test him. And they say, is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause? Right? This is Matthew 19:3. And he answered, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. What does Jesus do when he's questioned? He refers back to the Genesis account. Some people want to separate Jesus from the Old Testament. What is Jesus doing? He's validating the Old Testament, right? He's confirming it. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate. And then basically they go on and he says the reason Moses permitted a certificate of divorce was because of the hardness of heart. And he says in verse 9, and I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. Then the disciples said to him, man, if such is the case of a man with his wife, it is better not to marry, right? The disciples got the clue, wow, that's a high standard. But he said to them, not everyone can receive this saying, but only those to whom it is given. And then he goes on from there. So let's pick up now and finish up the text and start to drive toward some conclusions. As we're back in 1 Corinthians 7, he gives this charge to the married couples. He's talked to the unmarried and widows in verses 8 to 9. Then he talks to the married in verse 10 and 11. Now he's going to speak to those who are married to unbelievers. To the rest I say, and notice he says, I, not the Lord. You go, well, what's that about? What he means by that is the Lord didn't speak about what you do in the context of being married to a non-believer. The church hadn't started yet. That would happen in Acts chapter 2 with Pentecost. So the Lord hadn't spoken on it. So now he says, I'm speaking on it, but he's obviously speaking as one who has the authority, as an apostle. So he says, to the rest I say, I, not the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. And if any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is made holy because of his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy because of her husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. Now, holy, it just means that when you stay in that relationship, the idea is that the relationship is one in which one person is a believer and there's hope of the other person coming to Christ because the believer is living set apart. And therefore, there's the opportunity for the other to hopefully get saved if they remain in the marriage. And so when we keep reading, we come to verse 15. But if the unbelieving partner separates, now the word separate here means divorce. It doesn't mean separation like in American modern. That would be to read the Bible, read our culture into the Bible. If the unbelieving partner separates or divorces, let it be so. In such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved. In other words, if you're married to an unbeliever and an unbeliever walks away, what Paul's saying is that's another reason for you to get remarried again. And so what would my two questions be if I was talking to somebody who's been through a divorce, if they wanted to get remarried? I would ask, were you in a situation where your past spouse had an affair on you? And number two, or was it a non-believer? If it's not one of those two, I'm just going to say my conscience can't go beyond that from what I see in Scripture. But if you decide to do that, that doesn't mean, we're not going to love you, we're not going to care for you. You just got a conscience thing that I have to be obedient to here that I see in the Scripture. If you can show me how to see this otherwise, then I want to be open. And then I'll explain just a hint more about what that could look like if it was a little bit broader. So, how do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband, verse 16, or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? Not that the husband or wife will be the literal one to save their spouse, but you could even look at it like rescue. How do you know that because of your spiritual example that you could be used to rescue your spouse? So, I want to share with you briefly a wisdom model to consider. Because there are situations, right? So what we're seeing in the text so far is what? You can get a divorce and remarry if there's been adultery or abandonment by a non-believer. Now, some people talk about, if they've been abandoned, and they take that abandonment out of context because what they're doing is they're looking at 1 Corinthians 7, and it's about being abandoned by a non-believer, and then some people broaden the parameters so much, I've been emotionally abandoned. And I'm like, what does that even mean, right? Like, how deep is this? Like, where we've broadened it so much, and that's not even what it's talking about. It's talking about a non-believer abandoning. So now, I find myself thinking, okay, Jesus said that you can't get divorced and remarried unless, and he gives one reason, right? And what's that reason? Sexual morality, right? So, he gives one reason, but then Paul comes along, and he gives another reason. And so I'm like, okay, obviously Paul was an apostle, and, we can look at that as, being inspired by the Lord in what he's doing there because of his apostolic role. But how are we then to think about this? And I've entertained this idea of a wisdom model. There would have been a time where I would have thought no divorce for anything, then for those two reasons. But then as I think about it, I go, let me give you some situations that I think that I personally would feel like I get it, okay? Doesn't mean that I'm right on this. I'm just saying that I can get it. What do you do in a situation? Because I just think in scenarios. You're newly married, but you find out that your husband was a serial killer, and now he goes to prison for the rest of his life with no chance of parole. Do you tell the young 22-year-old that she's to be married till death do her part? I mean, that just seems like a wisdom. No, right? I mean, that's me. Now, some of you might be going, yeah, you stayed with the serial killer and you're married, right? And I'd be like, well, okay, I'm not seeing that, right? Or you're married and you're a lady, you're married to a man, but then your man wants to have a sex change and become a woman. Now, you thought you signed up to be married to a man, but now you told the Lord you're going to be committed to this man the rest of his life, but he doesn't want to leave you. He loves you. And he's going to go chop off his genitals, and he wants you to remain married to him. And he's going to start going on date nights with you, and it's going to look like you're in a same-sex relationship, right? But right? And you're uncomfortable because you are a heterosexual. And so that makes you feel weird. In the same way it might make somebody who's homosexual feel weird being with a heterosexual. Just might make you feel weird. Well, what do you do to that person? Like, what do I do as a pastor? And now, this is the story I just heard. Do I say, well, no, you got to be married forever? I think I would just say, it seems like you've abandoned the relationship here, right? Or, what do you do about physical abuse? Somebody's beating their spouse. I mean, do you tell somebody to just separate from somebody that physically beats the person up? So those are a few reasons that I just think it has to be very drastic, but I think that there comes a moment where you could just exercise some biblical wisdom as well, because there are some really hard situations.